Joe Reese, Nick Chan and Colin Lamb for BEMM390. Hofstede's theory can be broken down into 6 cultural dimensions: power distance index, individualism versus collectivism, uncertainty avoidance index, masculinity versus femininity, long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. The theory was developed by Gert Hofstede in 1980. The theory is a framework for identifying cross-cultural traits and how different cultures can influence the approach of people within the cultures. As mentioned, there are 6 dimensions. This PowerPoint will critique and explain the theory and give an example of how it can be used in the real world. The first one to look at is the power distance index. This looks at to what extent does the culture accept the inequality of power distribution. A high power distance culture puts emphasis on a hierarchy within the society. An example is South Korea. In South Korea, they'll have many leaders. A low power distance index means a more shared view of status and power, such as everyone being on the same playing field. Although there are managers, everyone shares the workload, such as in the United States or the United Kingdom. Individualism versus collectivism. This is the difference between the degree an individual in a specific culture gravitates towards personal achievements or group achievements. A culture that prioritises personal goals would be the United Kingdom or the United States, whereas a culture that works more as a team, is more collective and focused on group goals would be a country like China or other countries in Asia. Uncertainty avoidance index. Uncertainty avoidance index analyses how an individual from a different cultural background deals with uncertainty and ambiguous situations. These can be situations where the individual needs to choose between following strict guidelines or using their own initiative. A culture that scores high on this would be more risk averse and would put an emphasis and priority on stabilising a situation. They hold very strict guidelines from work approaches and don't deviate from the standard norm. An example of a country like this is Mexico. A low-scoring country would have a higher and a better tolerance towards situations in which they are uncertain, therefore having a less regulated approach and guidelines towards work. A good example of this is the United Kingdom. We often go out of the guidelines to make sure the job is done. Masculinity versus femininity. Distribution of values between genders within the society. Depending on the society being masculine or feminine, this determines what values and norms society would view as more valuable and more appropriate to them. These are specific on the roles gender play in the culture. A masculine culture puts emphasis on distinct gender roles driven by personal achievement and rewards. A way to identify countries like this is by looking at countries with large pay gaps, for example, Japan. A feminine society is more focused on collective interest, i.e. the quality of life, including shared gender roles. An example of this is Sweden and the United Kingdom. Long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. This determines the attitude and belief society has towards goal setting and future planning, whether or not they are planning for the long term or the short term. A long-term orientated culture would plan for the long-term future. They're less focused on short-term success and can see the bigger picture at hand. They are more concerned on important topics such as economic growth in the long run and the future of the world. A country where this culture is high is in China. There tends to be a higher long-term orientation in countries of a higher scoring collectivism, as they're more concerned about the end picture as a group, i.e. they're looking at the future for everyone. They're not in it just for themselves, they care about their grandkids. A short-term orientated culture would focus more on achieving short-term goals and obtaining short-term rewards. They're more focused on the present performance and the long-term future goals. This occurs more in societies with high individualism. An example is the United States, where they're looking at the short-term plans. Countries with democratic governments also tend to have lower scores on short-term orientation, as they are always changing. Indulgence versus restraint are the dimensions that determine how society values the satisfaction of human needs and human desires. It also looks at how appropriate it is to express a sense of satisfaction. This basically shows to the extent which a society deems it's okay to express and show emotions. An indulgent society is a society that allows the expression of positivity and satisfaction. It puts emphasis on the standard and quality of life, such as holidays and leisure time. A good example of this are the West. The Western culture has a high indulgence score. A restraint society is a society that has more rules and regulations and tends to follow a stricter path. Expression of satisfaction and joy is not encouraged. It's a culture where their expression of joy, happiness and positivity are less freely expressed. However, this does not mean these cultures are not happy, it's just not common practice to express them so freely. Asian societies and Eastern European countries often score highly on restraint. Criticisms of the model. There are a few criticisms of Hofstede's model, one being the different definitions on culture and what defines it. Some people view culture as countries, others view it as groups. Certain researchers, such as researchers from an economic background, may define it in a more quantitative way, i.e. a country, or in an economical way. They want to look at it as a whole figure. There's more than 164 definitions of the word culture, and therefore it's extremely hard to pin down what culture actually means. It means something different to everyone. Equivalency. The model assumes that a quality is perceived the same across culture, i.e. a male role in one culture may be deemed as a female role in a different culture, and you can see where the problem is. Sometimes something that's deemed as masculine by one culture may be deemed as feminine by another culture. Different cultures have different beliefs and understandings and theories, different ideas on roles. Relevancy. Some cultures are more sensitive to certain variables than others. For example, one culture may value one variable extremely high, such as collectivism, and another culture may value it extremely low. It may not mean anything to them, and therefore it deviates the results. Cultural homogeneity. Culture again is assuming a whole domestic population is homogeneous, when in reality the culture could be made up of many, many different ethnic groups and backgrounds. For example, having a lot of students from one country and another when the theory is being put out could drastically change the results and result in unfair answers as perhaps not a fair representation of the culture, as the students are only there for a short term and don't represent the culture as a whole. The model is conducted hard on individual responses. Responses may occur that ignore the importance of community and variations within a community. Another drawback is a one-company approach. The original study was based off one company. Validity may not apply to larger entities and may not accurately define cultural dimensions. There are political factors that also affect the results, such as world wars. World War II in Europe caused a high level of uncertainty avoidance and altered the perception of masculinity. The rise of communism in Asia, Africa and Europe also affects it, and there is also a huge difficulty in obtaining data from socialist and third world countries. There are cultures where some of the 6 dimensions bear no relevance whatsoever and they may not even understand what they mean. This theory can be used in all aspects of the business world. For example, working in sports management. In sports management, there are different cultures everywhere you look. For example, in a football changing room, there are over 15 different cultures, but they can be perceived as one culture when they're in the same country. Therefore, it's important to gauge an understanding of the different cultures. Using this framework, it's easy to understand why certain people from certain cultures will react in certain ways to certain situations. Although this theory has its criticisms, there are many academic papers to back up the research. Huang looked at the relationship between a response to security at airports using Hofstede's cross-cultural dimensions. He concludes that it's clear that visitors from high-power distance countries tend to be less satisfied with their experience of airport customs. This supports their theory down to the hierarchical structures they have back home. Relevance in the modern day. The theory is used in many academic papers, which shows us it's still relevant and a good way of analysing how different cultures operate. It's still used today, showing it stood the test of time as this theory is from the 80s, and it just shows it's a good theory. Can be applied in all aspects of business, from football changing rooms to generic offices to supply chains. For example, in supply chains, you can see why people within a supply chain may need to speak to management first based on where they're from and what their culture perceives. For example, you could be trying to push an order through, but someone could be waiting for their manager to come through, whereas in a different culture, they could accept the order themselves. It gives us a strong understanding of why different cultures act differently, and we can understand why certain people do certain things. However, it's not applicable to all cultures, as some value things completely differently and therefore it makes the theory irrelevant to some people. It's also not accessible for all cultures, as there's some very hard to reach demographics and populations. These are the references we use to critically underpin our analysis of Hofstede's cultural dimension theory. We looked at what alternative approaches there are, why it's questionable, and a case study on geothermal energy.